Hey everybody, so I'm pre-recording this lecture for you to watch in advance of class. Class will start officially at about 12:30. I'm just going to discuss the materials and the lecture with those who have already finished the lecture, but of course you are welcome to watch this lecture during class time. That's part of the intention of a pre-recorded lecture. I have a little more control, and that way you've got it available for you when you want to watch it. I can't emphasize enough how important it is to keep up with the readings. Perusal is not only the primary way that I'm going to be grading your participation in this unit, but it's also really important for you to see how all of this course hangs together. Now, I hope at this point you're starting to see the importance of starting with the science, getting that basic information down. And so now that we move into the ethics unit, we understand how to use that information in order to listen to others and to speak with others, to have a dialogue about these really important issues. So my job today is to talk about these four families of values that we've been talking about and to understand how they're related to climate change. I really want to spend a little more time talking about moral victory versus moral vision, because several of you are still confused about that distinction, and it's really important for us to understand. And then finally prepare ourselves to start reading Pope Francis's moral vision. So this unit, we've already begun with Dr. Greg Jenkins and talking about climate justice, and we're introduced this idea that climate ethics is systemic, critical, and creative. So this is what it offers to us as we try to deal with this issue of climate change. We've already addressed philosophical and religious points of view, and now we're looking at moral vision. That's our job this week, and this particular example of moral vision with Pope Francis. We'll be turning next week to preparing for the Conversation Project. We'll have another special guest, Janet Swim, who is a professor of social psychology, who's going to help us deal with some of the particular words and what they mean and how we can be effective in our communication with others. So there'll be a couple of workshops that will help you prepare for this major project in this unit, that Conversation Project. So climate justice is largely a matter of the ethics of the person. Remember, this is one of the four families that Weston introduces to us. There's lots of ways to look at climate justice. This bathtub image is one that I find particularly helpful, and it's a little more clear than the limit of temperature rise, because temperature rise, we can say we've gotten to 1 degree Celsius above, we're going to be at 1.5 degrees Celsius, we want to try to keep below 2 degrees Celsius. But the fact is that we can't really see this temperature rise on a year-to-year basis. We do see the temperature rise that happens actually after the fact. So what happens is that carbon dioxide levels go up and the temperature continues to rise. So for example, even if we stop producing carbon dioxide right now, we would still have an additional 0.5 degrees centigrade baked into the system. So when we talk about parts per million, that's much more clear and is a clearer line that we want to try to keep below. So right now we're at not 390 as this old graph tells you, but in fact 415. So we don't have a lot to go, and we can actually measure exactly how much carbon dioxide we can still put into the atmosphere in order to stay below this 450 parts per million. So what this tells us then is that we've got that bathtub just about full, and we're almost at the point of tipping over. We want to distribute then equitably the remaining carbon. How do we do that? Who deserves to, if you will, spend the remaining carbon in the system? Now, let's begin by understanding that the system itself is rigged, right? If we look at Pennsylvania and the median family income, it's about the same as throughout the United States, about $57,000 a year. In comparison, in Bangladesh, just to pick one country out there among many, the median family income is $600 a year. So we already have these gross disparities in the world as we begin. And those disparities map onto the level of carbon dioxide that's being put into the atmosphere. Now, we're just comparing Pennsylvania. This is not all of the United States. And note that Pennsylvania, with a population less than 1/10 that of the country of Bangladesh, produces much more carbon dioxide per year. So given this fact, then, that we have many fewer people right now in Pennsylvania producing much more carbon dioxide, what does justice demand of us? And we can look at the fact that in Bangladesh right now, the use of fossil fuels is increasing exponentially. So is it right for us to demand that they stop increasing? Or is our job to further reduce our carbon dioxide levels so that Bangladesh, a very poor country, can have more time to change over to a non-fossil fuel based system? This ultimately is this question of whether every person in the world has dignity. Do we treat every person as justice of the, or ethics of the person would demand? Do we treat every person as incommensurable? Or are we treating Bangladesh right now, Bangladeshis, as a means toward an end? Are we allowing ourselves to spend much more of the carbon budget and therefore causing more harm in the future? Now, of course, we also have inequality within countries. We know that in Pennsylvania, again, it is the rich who are using much more fossil fuels than the poor. And you just have to look at things like housing size, right? I mean, you know, if you're very wealthy and you have a 10,000 square foot house, that uses a lot of energy as compared to a more modest 2,000 square foot house that's pretty average, or something that a person might be living in terms of a mobile home of only 1,000 square feet. The point here is that the wealthy you are, the more likely you are to undertake air travel, to have a car, to have a couple of cars, and to really use a lot more carbon, even within the state of Pennsylvania. Moreover, we find that the wealthy tend to live in areas that are less vulnerable to the effects of climate change. Not only heat, if you're wealthy, you've got air conditioning, but also things like increased rainfall. So again, it's going to be the poorer people who are living in less desirable areas that are more susceptible to flooding, for example, from the heavy rainfall that we anticipate as being part of climate change. Now, when we look at a utilitarian calculus, again, this is the ethics of happiness. And again, it doesn't have to do with necessarily being happy. These are very sad things, but rather what action gives the most satisfaction to all considered. And we look into the future and we think about adapting as, again, adaptation and mitigation are two possibilities. When we talk about adapting to current harms, we talk about things like sea level rise, and it would be then the best for all concerned to do things like building dikes. So this picture here is of the new dike system in the south of Louisiana as a result from Hurricane Katrina. Again, as we learned from Robert Bullard, this dike system is unequal. It protects wealthier areas more than poor areas. The thing about moving populations and building dikes, again, this replicates the very injustice that we have in the system already. The fact is that when we consider benefits and harms, we have to admit that some people are going to make money out of climate change. Somebody's going to have to build those dikes. Somebody's going to be moving all those people. And in that process, actually making bank on the suffering of others. This all has to be considered in the utilitarian calculus of what you do. And so it may make sense to move populations now as opposed to paying them afterwards to rebuild their buildings that are only going to get destroyed in the long term. When we think about mitigation, we're talking about preventing future harm. So not just dealing with sea level rise that we have now, such as in New Orleans and heavy storms and that kind of thing, but actually considering what's going on in the future. And this now comes into a kind of economic calculus We talked about the economist William Nordhaus and his idea of putting a tax on carbon. Even though that is in the short term, in the near term, it's going to cost us more to use fossil fuels, the benefits for long term, including future growth, are much greater. And so we make this sort of calculus. We allow a certain amount of harm because the total benefit to the system is going to be better. And that's this idea behind a carbon tax, or as the people promoting it like to call it, a carbon fee and dividend. In this also, as we're thinking about future harms, we might be thinking about building resilience into the system. So this is a photo from Mexico Beach in Florida that was hit by a huge hurricane, one of these rapidly intensifying hurricanes. And what you see is that the entire town was wiped out except for this one building. And this one building was built to a much higher standard with those piers, for example, that you see in the front of the building. Actually, those are concrete piers that are sunk deep into the sand as opposed to just wooden piers that were swept away by the rising sea level, the storm surge from that hurricane. So we could, for example, insist that anybody who builds in a place like Mexico Beach builds to this standard so that we don't end up paying them to rebuild in the future. That kind of development focuses on saving property and saving some lives. But altogether, when we're focusing on these issues of building resilience, we're saying, you know, we can't just talk about reducing energy. If we're going to be ethical, reducing our carbon footprint, if we're going to be ethical, we also have to talk about saving lives now and saving lives in the near future and saving property in the near future. So there's a lot to do. It's not just about reducing our carbon footprint and changing our energy makeup. So this now gets us to the point where we have to talk about a moral vision. So we need a set of guiding principles for us to move into the future. Something that, again, Weston tells us is affirmative, is daring, is large scale, and is widely appealing. This is opposed to the idea of a moral victory. And I want to be very clear on this. A moral victory is short-term, political, and divisive. There are winners and there are losers with a moral victory. So right now, the Democrats have control of Congress. Certainly it's possible that they could ram through a carbon tax. But the problem with that moral victory, and it would be a victory, right? But the problem with that moral victory is that the backlash for that could be so strong that then it gets overturned in the next cycle. What we need, therefore, is a larger vision where everybody is on board. And in fact, the idea of a carbon tax might be part of that larger vision. But rather than just pushing it through as a political maneuver, it becomes part of a much larger set of issues that we all agree on. So that's what we're aiming for, is this idea of a moral vision. And the moral vision then itself can set the stage for radical actions like a carbon tax, but also like utterly remaking our energy system. It helps us, and I think that William McDonough is a terrific example of this, it helps us reset the very categories we're talking about. His dictum that waste is food, that instead of just flushing everything down the toilet and then treating this waste treatment plant and then sending all this off downriver, as opposed to mining that waste, and this is, I'm talking literally human waste now, mining that waste for the phosphates, for other items and chemicals that are actually useful for agriculture and other things, right? So thinking about these systems that we have and how instead of throwing things away, we want to build a circular system. This utterly changes our attitude towards what waste is. It can guide our action, and it allows us to think a little more broadly, not just reacting to the current problem in front of us, but really thinking, what do we want? What do we want the world to be? What do we want our place in that world to be? What are we called to do in this world? And here, religions help to answer this question. They always have. Religions are very generous with their idea of telling you what your place is in the world. And we can look at a lot of different religious traditions. We're focusing here on Catholicism, but consider also that for Buddhism, and here's an example of a fabulous a bodhisattva up in the mountains, who then focusing on the compassion necessary to relieve suffering is a way of resetting our ideas and getting us out of the rat race of the day-to-day responding to whatever problem there is, and thinking we are here to do something else. We are here, and according to Buddhism, to relieve the suffering of others, and others are all creatures within Buddhism, right? This is not just a matter of human beings, but paying attention to the suffering of animals and trees and all different living beings in the world. So this expansive idea is affirmative. It's daring, large scale. It appeals to the more than 1 billion Buddhists around the world, and to many other people who admire Buddhist ideals. And so Pope Francis also is doing this in the encyclical that we're reading for today and for on Friday. Because here he is speaking not just to Catholics, he is speaking to all the world. And his argument here is that the cry of the poor is the cry of the earth, that the poor and dealing with poverty is intimately tied up with dealing with climate change. And so a moral vision can reset what it is that we're doing right now. And of course, at this time in your lives, a lot of you are focused on what's going to happen next year and the year after, what you're going to do when you graduate from college. And that's totally reasonable. But what I'm trying to suggest is that we think about what we're doing right now a little bit differently. And I want to borrow a metaphor from baseball, the idea of a sacrifice fly. So, as most of you I hope know, in baseball, there is this play that if you've got a runner on a base and you've got a couple of outs ahead, the batter might actually hit a fly ball straight up that will allow that runner on the base to advance, and so that the team then gets the run, even though it means that the batter will be out. This notion of sacrifice, which is an essential part of sports, certainly it's a great play in baseball, is something that I think we need to take on in terms of understanding our role right now in terms of climate change, because these next several years matter. They matter much more than what's going to happen 20 or 30 years down the line. What we do right now, by right now I mean within this decade, if we can make a change in this decade, we can show the way to the world to getting down to zero carbon emissions, or maybe even below zero carbon emissions. And we can ensure for many future generations the possibility of a better life. This means that we have to live perhaps with less. We'll have to make some sacrifices, but really it's absolutely possible to live very well with less. If you consider the possible futures, right, the different things that we're spending, there are enormous resources. We've just proven this with spending $1.9 trillion on responding to the coronavirus. But the whole economy of the US is at $20 trillion, of which we spend $3.3 trillion every year just on healthcare. So when you think about the amount of money that's out there, could we make an investment? Could we commit ourselves to making an investment, especially now with the time of low interest rates, in a new electricity grid, in new solar and wind powered power plants, in new infrastructure for electric cars, in things that will make our lives better and radically reduce our carbon footprint? There are so many ideas out there. I love the concept of solar roads. That is this is actually, this is a test track here. So this is in beta right now, that instead of just asphalt lining our highways, you can build highways out of solar panels. And the highways then produce electricity. It's even possible to create a system where cars driving over the solar panels get charged up as they're driving. So we can eliminate stopping and recharging your battery. The notion of the Hyperloop seems like science fiction, but it's being tested out right now. Obviously, this is a real photograph of wind farms, not here. I think this one's from Brazil. But why not have wind farms spreading throughout the US and off the coast for offshore wind energy? These are the kinds of things that we can invest in right now and, again, make our lives better and present a better future for the next generations. So it's you, right? It's not about me. I've only got a couple decades left. It's you. So what is your radical vision? How are you going to change the world? And I want to really challenge you to think about the way that you might formulate this. And there are so many things you can do. I gave you the example here of a recent graduate from Penn State who started a nonprofit called Rebuilding the, who started a nonprofit which is devoted to rebuilding the inner city and investing in Black-owned businesses. Because we know that the unfair structure of our society gets replicated in times of stress, whether it's coronavirus or whether it's climate change, working on issues of Black lives, working on issues of poverty, building resilience in these marginal communities, all of this is a way of responding to climate change. You may want to just get rid of your car, right? I mean, it's radical, but you can do it. Penn State now has a ride-sharing program that you can join. Of course, we have our bus system here, but there are electric bikes and other kinds of alternatives that are very low power. I love electric skateboards. They're super cool. And it's a way of changing the concept of mobility to a very low carbon concept. What about the effect you can have on your parents? Who needs a 5,000 square foot house? Do they really need to have so many cars? The average family has 2.5 cars. Or can they get down to 1 car or buy an electric car? What ways can you influence the people around you to make these kinds of changes? And from there, then scale up, work on your town, start a nonprofit, deal with Penn State's carbon footprint, or we will be learning how Penn State is radically reducing its carbon footprint. So tell that story as a proud Penn Stater. Work on your state. And in this way, you can be part of a community working together to implement this radical vision. So Pope Francis also has a vision, and we were going to spend some time thinking about this. Nice little cartoon that came out when this encyclical came out about 5 years ago. It really made quite a splash, and both positively and negatively. You will see, as you're reading this, that this connection with poverty is honestly taking on the wealth disparities in the world. And if you look here at this map, you'll see that the countries that are in black have a tremendously large per capita income as compared to countries in dark green and then lighter green, to the point that we get to the very light green, and these are indeed very, very poor countries. You'll see that Bangladesh is not the poorest of the poor. There are many much poorer countries than Bangladesh, the example that I'm taking on today. So wealth itself is distributed unevenly. Remember, US family income is 57K per year. The median world family income is about 1/6 of that. So with this, we understand that altogether in the US, we are the wealthy. We are the powerful. We have an opportunity to make changes, to use our privilege of wealth to make a significant change. Wealth disparity right now is increasing. The US compared to the world, you see that a small percentage of the world controls most of the wealth. And as we look, this disparity is increasing as the richest 10% of the families are getting more wealth in the US, and also in the world, the same thing's happening, where the richest 1% now control about half of global wealth. Think of that. The richest 1% control about half of the world's wealth. That's an astonishing figure. And especially if we stop identifying with the wealthy here and we start to think what it's like to live in a world where not only you have nothing or next to nothing, but nobody you know has anything or any possibility, and in many places, no voice, right? So we have enormous privilege. It is unfair, but we have it. And with that, I would argue, comes a responsibility to do something. Interestingly, the clearest connection demographically to your carbon footprint is your wealth. Not only do wealthy countries use more energy, wealthy individuals within those countries use more energy. And this is a nice graph that shows you that the poorest half, these are billions of people, the poorest half of the world only produces about 10% of the world's carbon dioxide emissions. So what we have to do is really work on that richest 10%, because that's, again, we have an opportunity to make a radical change. And the majority of the world, it frankly doesn't matter if they change their carbon footprint, because their carbon footprint is already so small that any change they make is going to have a negligible impact on carbon dioxide levels as a whole. So again, this is Pope Francis's point that the cry of the earth is the cry of the poor, and that to respond, his vision for responding to climate change is responding to poverty. So looking ahead, we have our response papers today, and focus, of course, is on Pope Francis and the encyclical. Friday, we're going to have a webinar with me. So that same format of a webinar, those of you who are presenting your papers will be on a panel with me. Next week, be aware of that quiz coming up on the 24th, which is going to be a multiple choice quiz on Canvas, and we'll focus largely on the readings, and with, of course, the idea that these lectures help to emphasize the key aspects of these readings. And at the end of March, we have our conversation project. Please do go ahead and look at that description on Canvas so that we can start to think about this and we can answer your questions. Okay, so that's my lecture. I look forward to talking with you in class. And as always, leave me any comments here on perusal or ask me questions. Be happy to discuss this at any point.